I am here today with Shelby Abbott, who works for Family Life, which is the sort of family ministry of Crew. And he is also an author of numerous books, including his most recent book, which is called DoubtLess, Because Faith is Hard. Well, it's so nice for you to be with us today, Shelby.
Thanks for having me, Ruth. I appreciate it.
Well, I guess the first question would be, what was the motivation behind this book? It's got quite a clever sort of title, hasn't it? Doubtless,
Yeah.
Doubtless.
Yeah. It was kind of this, marketing strategy it's talking about doubt, the subject of doubt. And then in the process of going through that, you can become doubtless to doubtless. So it's a little play on words, but that was one of the things that I was processing and thinking and feeling. I have a struggle with that specifically through not necessarily believing whether or not God is real, but believing whether or not he's good, if he's sovereign, those kind of things. I'm a chronic pain patient. And so I have a herniated disc in my back. And so I've wrestled through doubts in a lot of ways of if God's ability to get things done. But working with students, I've been working with college students for over 21 years. A couple of years ago, I had a couple of students come to me on a summer mission that I was on and communicate to me that a bunch of the doubts that they were experiencing because they had taken a religion class and their professor had seemingly shot a bunch of holes in Christianity. And so they were very confused. And I realized very quickly that a lot of students were wrestling with this. And so that combined with my brother-in-law, my wife's youngest brother, had what he called a spiritual deconstruction journey that lasted over the course of several years. And talking with him about that right around the same time that I thought was a lot of students were wrestling with this. And so I said, what would I want to read if I were a younger person, and what would help me in the process of doubting to do it well, as opposed to kind of fading away from my faith slowly over time. So that was kind of the genesis of it.
And I love what you say in your book, that it's not really a question of if we'll doubt, but when. And
Right.
You've obviously touched on this a little bit, but are there do you see a pattern of doubts? Is it the same doubts that come up with the people that you're dealing with, or do they seem to be completely different depending on what it is that they're going through?
Yeah, I would hesitate to say that it's the same thing over and over. I will say that our culture now has fostered an environment where it's very popular and kind of celebrated to doubt, as opposed to there being like one thing specifically. Granted, there are several things that come up pretty regularly. The authority of the Bible is can we trust it? Is it really God's word? Is one that's pretty popular. And then, did Jesus really rise from the dead? And I actually, my book is not an apologetics book per se. I do handle a little bit of that in one chapter specifically talking about the resurrection. But I think that it's just a lot of issues that people wrestle with and struggle with. And then as a result, because the culture kind of fosters and celebrates that idea of like, yeah, it's great to question. You should definitely dive deeper into those things. And while I don't necessarily disagree with that, there's a difference between expecting that you will doubt and then celebrating doubt. Because when you celebrate it, you start to become obsessed with it, and it becomes kind of your primary means of processing all information about God and spiritual things and stuff.
I suppose some of the things that you've touched on there, whether the Bible's reliable, all of that they're quite intellectual doubts, I suppose, aren't they, for want of a better word? Do you find that people also, as well as the intellectual doubts, are there people whose doubts are much more personal, heartfelt, I suppose, about the character of God? And I guess some of the things that you were touching on around pain and suffering, do they seem to outweigh the intellectual, or is it a kind of mixture of both in your experience?
In my experience, oddly enough, in higher education, it starts with more emotional stuff. It starts with more personal stuff, and then people start to dive into things. Or a professor will shoot something out there, and or they'll have a conversation on campus, and it's an environment where people are encouraged to ask questions and encouraged to learn and grow. But I'd say that most of the people that I talk to, it ends up being something that, like, they hear something or they read something or they see something online, and it begins to coincide with an experience that they've had personally before. And those two kind of come together to form a perfect storm, for lack of a better phrase. And then that just sends them down the rabbit hole in a number of different ways. And so what I really wanted to achieve with the book is to say kind of what you had mentioned, that it's not really a matter of if you will doubt, it's really a matter of when. And so what can we do to prepare ourselves in a healthy way when doubt comes? Because life is going to be hard. Like, it's going to eventually smack you in the face in one form or another. And if you're not prepared spiritually to be able to dive into the difficult issues that you wrestle with, that you will wrestle with in the future, you're going to be thrown for more of a loop than you need to be.
And I thought you had quite a helpful differentiation in your book where you talk about the fact that doubt is not the same as unbelief. Would you just unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, doubt is not the same as unbelief in the sense that, and kind of the parallel that I make with that is that temptation is not the same thing as sin. Temptation can lead to sin, just like doubt can lead to unbelief, but they are not equivalent to one another. So unbelief is something that is an intentional decision that someone makes to say, for example, there is no God, or God is not good, or the Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. Those are conclusions that someone reaches. Doubt is a process that people can wrestle with on a very regular basis. And the way I kind of like to equate it is if you consider doubt to be a little bit like a house guest who comes over to your home. When a house guest comes over to your place, they're sleeping on the couch, they're using your bathroom, they're putting dishes in the sink, they're kind of messing things up at the flow of your life. But then at the end of the weekend, they're always meant to pack up their stuff and leave. That's what doubt is supposed to be like in our lives. Doubt can come in and it can shake things up in our lives for a bit, but they're always meant to leave. If doubt were to set up pitch a tent in your living room and stay permanently, that would be abnormal. And so that's what I try to communicate to a believer, is that it's abnormal to obsess over these things and to constantly question these things, but it can come in, it can mess things up for a little bit and then pack up and leave. And in reality, we are the better for it. Just like working out a muscle in a gym, when you break it down, it builds up back stronger. And doubt has the ability to do that with our faith.
There's a brilliant phrase, which again, you touched on it just there, but you say in your book that unbelief is a conclusion that someone reaches. It's a deliberate decision to live as if there is no God. And I suppose we've kind of seen that, haven't we, with lots of Christians, it seems particularly this year, have sort of quite famously lost their faith. We've had quite a few of those on the show on Unbelief. We've had Joshua Harris, John Steingard. Do you think doubt has played a huge part in that, or are there many other things in their deconversion? For want of a better word?
Right. I think it varies depending on the person. And I think that doubt, what I've seen, and this is why I wanted to write the book, is that I've concluded that people are not handling their doubts in the appropriate way. And so what normally happens in the context of at least college students is that they'll have a doubt, something will kind of jostle them a bit, whether intellectually or emotionally, and then they'll kind of keep it to themselves and they won't actually like process it in a healthy way. And they just kind of start to fade into the background and walk away from their faith slowly over time. And so I know of several people who have done this. I used to work with two of these guys who are a little bit more famous online, Rhett and Link. They were on staff with Crew, the organization I work for several years. I worked them a very long time ago over the course of this conference that we did together. And
they're YouTubers now, aren't they?
They're YouTubers. They kind of got on the YouTube train very early, and it worked out really well for them. They ended up leaving staff and going into the entertainment business full time. And it was just mostly, they were doing family entertainment stuff that's just funny and wholesome. And then recently, about a year or two ago, I saw a couple of things they were putting out there on social media. And I was like, I wonder if they're doing okay spiritually. And then they released this 4-part podcast of the spiritual deconstruction of both of their faiths. And so as a result of that, since I knew them a long time ago, I don't know them now, just to be clear. I haven't communicated with them in several years. But I felt like, their audience speaks to a lot of the audience that I minister to. And so I felt like I had a unique opportunity to be able to communicate something. So I wrote an article, just a simple article on my really poorly trafficked website, and it ended up going viral. I've never gone viral before. It's actually not that great. People are pretty mean out there, but I felt like it was what I needed to do to speak to it. And it was just some red flags that I saw in their spiritual deconstruction. And so as a result, people have asked me a lot of questions about it. I've kind of got thrown into the limelight right before the lockdown happened in the US. And there's nothing like a world altering pandemic to push you out of the news cycle. So I got out pretty quick, but consequently I've had lots of great opportunities to talk to people about it. And when they talked about it, it was wrestling with these questions and these doubts and just kind of obsessing over them. I saw that happen with kind of both of them. And I remember their personalities and kind of how they dealt with stuff. And so no doubt there was a lot of doubt in both of their lives, and they dealt with it in ways that led eventually to what they call, unbelief. They call it hopeful agnosticism, which when you think about it, doesn't really mean anything.
So I suppose in a nutshell, what were some of the responses that you gave on that blog? And I guess if they were in front of you now, what would you want to tell them?
Well, I didn't ever expect that they would actually read the article. I know now I'm 99.9% sure that they actually have, because there's been a few people who are close to them that reach out to me and talk to me about it. But if I were to be in front of them, I would respectfully disagree with a lot of things that they said. And they're really great at being able to predict the kind of responses a person will have when they talk about their deconstruction. And so I don't know if that's, training over the years of being online and being YouTube famous and saying those kind of things, but they're really good at saying, you're going to ask me this and you're going to say this. But if I were to talk to them and say what I could to them, I'd ask them to reconsider the deconstruction that they made as being more of a deconstruction of the Christian culture that they grew up in. And then I would also ask them to consider if you genuinely believe that becoming a Christian, that God transforming your heart is a miracle, it's a gift of grace, there's really no such thing as spiritual deconstruction, as Christian deconstruction. There's no such thing as that, because if you believe that God, spiritually reaches into your heart and pulls out a heart of stone and replaces it with a heart of flesh, that is a miracle. It's a gift of grace. It's nothing that you do. It's all on his side. That is not, it's not possible to deconstruct that, because it's a gift of grace. So if you tell me, I believed, I did this, I read this, I said this, I shared my faith, I prayed, he was real to me, but now he's not, this sounds like a list of the things that you did in order to become a Christian. It sounds like works to me as opposed to grace. So I would really double click on, for lack of a better phrase, my Reformed theology and talk to them about what it means to be a Christian. What does it actually mean to be a Christian? Is it a miracle? If it is, which it is, God doesn't undo miracles like that. So I would really encourage them to consider those kind of things, those kinds of questions. But I don't think they want to talk to me.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about practical ways to deal with doubt in a second. But firstly, you list quite a lot of examples in your book about how doubt is biblical. So you sort of lay out some of the Bible characters that wrestle with doubts, which is really helpful. So how are some of the ways that we doubt well in a way that doesn't lead to unbelief?
Yeah. So biblically, the examples that I use are from the Old Testament. I mean, it's all over the place, but in the Old Testament, the Psalms, I ran across this quote from a pastor who said, the Psalms give us permission to beat on God's chest. And I really love that kind of visceral imagery of what it looks like. Because when you read the Psalms, they often live outside the pocket of where normal range of human emotion exists. They're either like really negative or really, really positive. And that, if anything, helps us to understand that, hey, this is a normal human thing. It's okay to wrestle with doubt. And then the New Testament example, doubting Thomas is the obvious one, and I get to him eventually, but the primary example I used was John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the precursor to the Messiah. He was the one who said, "Behold, the Lamb of God, it takes away the sin of the world." He was the one who baptized Jesus. And when he did, the skies opened up and an audible voice came from heaven that said, "This is my son." You would think that nobody would really question that. But yet at the end of his life, he's in prison. He sends a few of his disciples to Jesus and says, "Are you the one, or should we expect another? And some people might read that and go, really? I mean, for crying out loud, you baptized Jesus and you heard the audible voice of God come from the sky and say, this is the one, and yet you're still doubting. But I read that kind of thing and I'm like, well, I guess I'm in good biblical company. If John the Baptist can doubt and he heard God's voice, that gives me permission to doubt. And so I want to talk about in the book, not just like the ethereal, it's okay to do that, but give someone practical examples of how to deal with it in a healthy way. And so there's a number of different ways that I feel like are kind of practical strategies to fight back against doubt. One of them is practicing thankfulness in general. That's something that at least Western people don't do that much. And so when you're intentionally thankful for the blessings that you have around you, it's really difficult for thankfulness and a spirit of doubt to occupy the same space for a long period of time. So that's one of the things I talk about. One of them is to get with real and the right people. So again, I touched on this earlier, but like if you're going to be isolated in the process of doubt, you're just going to get killed. You're going to get picked off spiritually. Satan loves to go after the stragglers who are on their own. And so if you're doing it, if you're doubting, you're questioning in the context of a healthy, authentic Christian community where you feel safe to ask those kind of questions, lean on others around you and be in community, that's going to do nothing but help you. So get with the right people. One of them is preach the gospel to yourself every single day, every single hour, every single minute. The longer I've been a believer, the more and more I've realized that the gospel isn't just something that we share for people who don't believe. It is for me every waking moment. I need to remind myself, because humans, if anything, are extremely forgetful. So preach the gospel to yourself. And then I encourage people to preach the gospel to others. It's really difficult to continually live in doubt when you're sharing your faith with others. Just like a teacher knows the material better than the students, you're able to dive into the gospel in a lot more healthy way, and as you're communicating it with other people and encouraging them to believe. And so that, combined with like good Orthodox reading and being intentional. So those students that I ran into that one time, they asked me a bunch of questions. I asked them, have you read this? This was answered nicely in this. And they were like, I don't know who that is. And I'm like, hey, guys, you just need to put in the work, because the questions that you think are unique to you have actually been asked for thousands of years. You just got to be willing to put in the work to actually go find some quality answers to stuff. And now with the internet age, stuff has never been more available. So don't be lazy about it, because if this is a matter of life and death, and it is, like, put in the work, go find the answers, and they're there.
I suppose on the flip side of that, one of the things that you say in the book is it's different knowing about God to knowing God personally. And I suppose, how do we do that? Because I guess it's one thing going and reading all those things and learning about God, but how do we sort of actively cultivate that personal relationship with God so that becomes easier?
Yeah. And that's really what I saw happening with my brother-in-law in this whole process, is that when he started to really slip quite a bit, he ended up writing this like short little manifesto about what he believed and what he did not believe anymore. And he communicated to me like, these are the things that I've done. These are the things that I genuinely believed, and now I don't anymore. And I found like a theme in there, even with Rhett and Link too, is that they knew a lot about God. They knew the culture. They knew the Bible verses. They knew how people would pray. They'd know the jokes about the culture. They'd know how to mock different things, which we all do all the time. But like, if you're entrenched in the culture, you can start to recognize that this is a cultural thing, that I know a lot about God, but do I actually know him? Has my heart been transformed? Am I actually born a second time, as opposed to knowing a lot about him? And I think the danger here in knowing a lot about him can be often substituted for an authentic relationship with him. And so when you come to the end of your life, it's not going to be like, if Jesus says, away from me, I never knew you, you could say, but but I prayed the prayer, but I knew the Bible verses, but I shared my faith. It's not like away from me. I never like understood what Christianity was. It's not that. It's away from me. I never knew you. And so do you actually know God, or do you just know a lot about him? And the way I kind of equivalate that is that if you're a single person and you're living in the world today of online dating and all that kind of stuff, you can swipe right a couple of times on a dating app and then start to stalk that person, because that's authentically what happens. You can start to look up and you can learn a lot of things about that person, like what their favorite foods are, what they listen to, their style, blah, blah, blah. You can know a lot about them, but until you actually meet them and engage in a relationship with them, you don't really know that person. So if you know a lot of things about me based on my social media profiles, and then you and I meet and you assume that you know who I am, I'm going to be offended by that, because you don't actually have a relationship with me. Do you know a lot about me? That's great. That's part of the picture. But until you actually are in relationship with me and you know me, that's a totally different relationship. In fact, those are two like worlds apart from one another. Knowing a lot about God is not the same as actually knowing God. And I think every Christian needs to really wrestle with that, knowing whether or not they actually know a ton about him, or do they actually know him. And so when I see that with people like, Joshua Harris, Rhett and Link, even my brother-in-law, it sounds to me like you knew a lot about God, but you never really knew him. And of course, I don't know that God knows their hearts. And I'm not going to arrogantly, kind of pompously say that. I know I would be accused of that if I said those kind of things, because it's very offensive, especially in today's culture. But it's just what the Bible communicates. It's not about knowing about him. It's actually being in relationship with him.
I don't know whether this is the same in the States, but in the UK, certainly, nowadays it's quite a commonplace thing for youth groups and student groups to be a place where people can bring their questions and discuss things and come with those difficult questions. Whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago in youth groups, you were just sort of told to maybe don't worry about the questions, just believe, just have faith, perhaps even leave your brain at the door when you come into the youth groups.
Right.
Why do you think we were like that? Why do you think we were so sort of down on doubts and trying to squash people's questions and doubts?
I think a lot of it had to do with fear. I think if people start to ask questions about stuff, we immediately jump to, well, they're going to get to a certain space in their mind, and it's going to lead their heart away from God. And so there's fear with that, of like, granted, the culture shifts all the time, and I think I grew up in kind of the 90s culture, and that's definitely what the vibe was. It was like, just believe this, don't question it. This is what's right. Therefore, you don't have the right to be able to explore what is quote unquote wrong. And so that mentality, I've noticed this as a parent. My kids are young. I have a 9 and a 7-year-old, and I feel like even when they ask a bunch of questions that I don't know the answer to, I need to fake it and pretend like I do know what the answer is. But that is really unhealthy as a parent. I think that if people have questions now, and you're a youth group leader or a pastor or even a parent, and your kids ask you questions and you don't know the answer to the question, don't fake it, because if you do, that will come up again. As much as the stuff that we swept under the rug in early parts of ministry when I was doing it, of like, don't ask questions, like you said, check your brain at the door, it's fine, just believe. That has come up and bitten us now in our current culture, because like I said, when life gets hard, we will ask those questions again. And then if there haven't been solid answers that were given to us, we'll quickly deconstruct the Christian culture that we grew up in. And that will lead to really dangerous places in our faith now. So I think if like I said, if you're a leader or you're a parent and you don't know the answer to a question, a good answer is, I don't know. Let's find out together. Because again, you could find the answers. There's satisfying answers to the questions that people throw out there and go, well, what about this? It's like, that question's been asked for a long time. I'm not sure what that answer is. Let's go find out together. Not just with reading, but I mean, the way that YouTube and the stuff that's posted out there, I've learned a ton in my faith theologically, just by going to search out the right answers for things. So find out the answers, but don't pretend like you know everything.
As a dad and someone who's been working with students for 20 years, how do you respond to those statistics that talk about young people leaving the church in droves? I guess particularly when they get to the end of high school. Do you think they're leaving the church, or do you think they're leaving their faith? Because I suppose it's one thing if they're leaving the kind of constructed church, but they still have a faith of their own, and they're pursuing it in different ways. So I guess it's twofold, that question. Do you think they're leaving their faith? And if so, what are some of those big reasons, do you think, for that?
Well, I mean, you could dive into the theology of it and say, are they leaving their faith? Well, if they never had a faith in the first place, they're not actually leaving their faith. But I think that it comes down to authenticity in what you communicate from the pulpit or what you're communicating in youth group, and then living the exact same way. I found that hypocrisy is not dealt with very well. Like, people don't respond to hypocrisy well, even more so, exponentially more so today. So if you're communicating something publicly, like I said, either from the pulpit or in the youth group, and your life does not reflect what you actually communicate from your sermons or your messages, your talks or whatever, people are quick to sniff that out. And when they get to a spot where they're leaving from high school and going to college or out in the working force or whatever, they'll quickly go, well, they never actually really believe that. And if they didn't believe that, what's the point? How is this going to work for me if the person who's supposed to be the professional Christian, the pastor or whatever, how is this ever going to work for me if a person who spends their life preaching about it doesn't really work for them too? So I think there's a combination between several factors, and it needs to be intentional communication from upfront about what the Bible actually communicates. So good theology that's communicated and how that's applicable to our lives, and then living it out as well, so that we don't get certain things like hypocrisy, people walking away from their faith, hipster Christianity that's only popular because it's mirroring what the world thinks is great, that kind of stuff. Is there life change communicated and then actually lived with our leaders? I think that's a big factor.
If you could go back to your teenage self, knowing everything that you've kind of learned along the way, is there anything that you would tell yourself, I suppose, particularly in the area of doubt and unbelief and things like that?
Yeah, I would say to myself, life is not going to go the way that you think it will. So I would say, I mentioned I struggle with chronic pain. That's never something that I would have picked for myself off of a list as a way to become more sanctified and more Christ-like. I wouldn't have said, yeah, physical pain, I'll pick that one. But it has been, the way that God has worked in my heart the most significantly. I have been able to see Jesus in ways that I never would have before. So to say, hey, when that happens, you're going to doubt pretty significantly in what you actually believe. Your faith is going to be tested in ways that you never thought were possible. So grace, rely on God's grace. It is about him working in your life, and as he works, when you're in his hands, if he's a bad God, an evil God, a sadistic God, or if he's not sovereign, you should be terrified. But he's not any of those things. He's a good God. He's a loving God. He's a sovereign God. He knows exactly what he's doing. Your view of him is quite small right now. It will grow, but stay rooted in the fact that God's grace is what will make you who you are. It will transform your life, and it will help you to understand who Jesus was in ways that you never thought were possible. And to become more Christ-like is a good thing. It's always a good thing.
How do we find out more about Shelby Abbott and your book, DoubtLess?
It's on Amazon, of course, like every other book in the universe. But you can, my website is just shelbyabbott.com, ABBOTT. And my books are there. My blog is there. It's not a super flashy website, but you can find some stuff there about what I'm doing and some of the writing that I've done in the past.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Ruth. I appreciate it.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.